Death and the Cornish Fiddler by Deryn Lake. Side 7. It was by now 7 o'clock, and the weary men, having towelled and dressed themselves, started the walk back into town. As they did so, William beckoned John to one side. "Excuse me asking, sir, but have you any experience of this kind of thing? I mean through your apothecary inn or such like?" John decided to admit everything. "Yes. As a matter of fact, I work from time to time with Sir John Fielding, the principal magistrate of London. Years ago, I was briefly suspected of committing a murder, but fortunately, when he questioned me, Mr. Fielding, as he then was, realized I was telling the truth. I assisted him to find that murderer, and I've been doing so ever since, off and on. London's a long, long way from here, sir, of course, but I reckon you must be thought something of to work with Sir John. Have you heard of him?" "No, sir. To be honest, I haven't. He's blind, you know. He's known to the mob as the Blind Beak." "You don't say." "And talking of that, what do you know about the Blind Fiddler?" The constable chuckled. "The gaffer? Not very much, really. He first appeared on Flora Day about 5 years ago. He organizes the music, as you've heard for yourself. None of them, not he nor his band, want paying for the privilege. Instead, they send a boy round. Well, this year it was a monkey with a hat. Then they move on. I reckon they'll be going in a day or two." "And what about the rest of the people?" John asked. "Will they be off soon?" "Oh, yes. In the next few days, the town will return to normal." "And Isabel's murderer, if he exists, will walk away with the others? That is, if she is dead." Trethowan stopped in his tracks, forcing the apothecary to do likewise. "You may believe me a superstitious fool, Mr. Rawlings, and I suppose that in many ways I am. But I have great faith in Gypsy Orchard. She's been around Helstone ever since she was a thin little girl fending for herself, and I've asked her about things in the past, and what she has told me has always come about. So, if she says to me that Isabel is drowned, then drowned the child is." It was a great testament of belief, and in the face of such blazing sincerity, John would have felt cheapened and somehow shabby if he had argued. Instead, he said, "Then you face a difficult situation, Constable." "I've a plan for that, sir." "And what is it?" "To ask everyone staying at the Angel Inn to remain a few more days while I continue to search. And if they refuse, then I shall regard them as mighty suspicious and question them hard. And if that doesn't work, then I shall reluctantly be forced to let them go." John was silent, resuming his walk back to Helstone, thinking that both he and the constable were going to have a great deal to do before people left the town for good. He was still contemplating where it would be best to start when he reached the front door steps of the hostelry and turned in, meeting Muriel Legassic and Tabitha Bligh on their way out. "Good morning, ladies," he said pleasantly. They both bobbed curtsies. "Good morning, Mr. Rawlings, and a very fine one, too." "When are you thinking of leaving, may I ask?" he inquired politely, getting straight down to business. Mrs. Legassic smiled, and her eyes behind her spectacles loomed suddenly large. "Well, it rather depends on the Colquites. They are all for us remaining at the Angel for a few days more, but then they live close by, and do not have the tedious journey back to Wiltshire to contend with. But we shall make up our minds today, you may depend on it." Tabitha, who had been running her eyes over the apothecary, said, "And what about you, Mr. Rawlings? What are your plans?" "I shall probably remain for another few days," he said airily. "It rather depends on the Marchesa's wishes." "Oh, yes, of course, your travelling companion." Tabitha robustly stressed the last two words. "How delightful it must be for you, to be sure, to have such a charming lady to escort." "Oh, yes, it is. Very. "Good day, ladies." And bowing once more, the apothecary made his way inside. It was shortly after 7 in the morning, and the general flow of people were coming down to breakfast. John, realizing that he looked a scallywag, but not really caring, decided to join them, hoping that Elizabeth and Rose would soon put in an appearance. The early morning exercise had given him a ravenous appetite, and he ordered ham, eggs, herrings, and various other delicacies that the bill of fare was offering. He was just through his third slice of gammon when Rose entered the room alone. He stood up and kissed her. "Good day to you, my darling. Did you sleep well?"
"Yes, thank you, Papa."
"And where is Mrs. Elizabeth?"
"I knocked on her door, Papa, but she didn't answer."
John looked up from his food. "Strange. I hope she's all right."
"Perhaps she didn't hear me."
Nonetheless, I think I'll go and check. Now, you stay here like a good girl and eat your breakfast. I shall only be a few minutes. Wait for me, Rose." Leaving the table, the apothecary hurried up the stairs and gave a loud knock on the Marchesa's door. There was no reply, and acting on instinct, he went to Mrs. Pill's room and knocked there. "Come in," said Tim Paynter's voice. Opening the door, he found Catherine, Tim, and Elizabeth talking together earnestly. "I'm sorry. Am I intruding?" They looked up, and John took in the fact that Mrs. Pill was not only up and dressed, but had a most determined expression on her face. The Marchesa got to her feet. "I've taken up enough of your time." Catherine spoke.
"No, my dear. You have been most kind."
She turned to John.
"Mr. Rawlings, I have decided to return home and fetch what few male servants I have. They, together with my brother, will then return and search Helstone high and low for Isabel. You see, I will never believe she is dead until I see her body for myself. I think she is being held captive in someone's house. That is what I reckon."
John would like to have agreed with her, but Gypsy Orchard's face, as she described water coming over her head, returned to haunt him. "I hope you're right," he said feebly. Tim spoke up. "I shall stay and continue the search in the meantime." Surreptitiously, Elizabeth and John exchanged a look, remembering his performance on the previous evening with Diana Warwick. Then they chorused, "Yes." Mrs. Pill put on her travelling cloak and arranged a hat on her head. "My coachman waits below," she announced, and proceeded from the room, Tim Paynter at her heels. John and Elizabeth descended the staircase more slowly. The Marchesa turned to look at him. "Did you find anything this morning?" He shook his head. "No, I'm afraid not." "The child is dead, isn't she?" "According to Gypsy Orchard, yes. And that woman is a charmer, which means she has an ancient gift." "Really?" Remembering the gypsy's prophecy about his son, John suddenly gave a broad grin. "And what are you smiling about?" asked Elizabeth, giving him a sideways glance. "Wouldn't you like to know?" John answered. They entered the dining parlour together, and the apothecary looked across at his table. His daughter, whom he had left sitting there, promising her father that she would wait for him, was missing. He turned to Elizabeth. "Rose, where is she?" She stared at him blankly. "When did you last see her?" "She was down here, eating breakfast with me. I told her to stay, but—" John hastened to the serving girl. "My daughter was sitting at that table." He pointed. "Did you see where she went?" "She went away with a lady, sir." "Who? Do you know her?" "Yes, sir. She's staying here, but I'm not sure of her name." "Thank you." He and Elizabeth were off, flying down the street in different directions, calling Rose's name loudly. Inside himself, John felt physically sick, the horrible thought going through his mind that there could be a gang of child abductors at work in Helstone, and that Rose was their latest victim. Having run the length of Coinage Hall Street and back on the opposite side, he saw Elizabeth hurrying down on the other part of the road. Calling her name, he ran rapidly across and joined her. Too out of breath to speak, she merely shook her head. John gasped, "Let's look in the stable yard." They passed under the lamp-hung arch, and then stopped dead. Sitting on the wall by the well was Anne Anstey, clearly recovered from her choking fit of the previous night. Next to her was Mrs. Legassick, and wedged in between them, clearly hanging on every word Anne was saying to her, was Rose.
"Don't be angry," said Elizabeth quietly. "Remember, she's young yet."
John put on as pleasant a countenance as he was capable of, and walked forward, calling his child's name. She looked up, startled, then scrambled off the wall. But it was at Mrs. Anstey that he was actually staring, so that her expression made a sharp impression on him. Just for a second he saw guilt, followed by a conscious effort to mask that emotion. Then her usual lecherous expression returned as she ran her eyes over the apothecary, standing there in his rough-and-tumble state. "What a delightful daughter you have, Mr. Rawlings. She and I have just been getting better acquainted." "So I see," John replied unpleasantly.
"Run along to your father, dear."
But Rose had already crossed the short distance between them and had wound herself around the apothecary's legs. And it was at that moment, with the air full of tension and John wondering how to handle the situation, that a first-floor window flew ajar and a maid's frantic face appeared in the opening.
"Help!" she screamed. "Somebody please come!"
Every head craned back as they all looked upward. "What's the matter?" called John.
"Oh, sir, it's Miss Warwick. Oh, come at once. I think she's been murdered."
Chapter 14. She was lying on the bed, quite naked. And just for a moment, John caught himself admiring the perfect figure topped by a pair of exquisite, shapely breasts. Then he remembered where he was and took himself to task. Crossing to Diana Warwick's side, he bent over and applied his fingers to the pulse in her neck. There was nothing. It was as the chambermaid had suspected. Miss Warwick was dead. The apothecary straightened up. "I think, my girl, that you had better send for a physician."
"Oh, yes, sir. I'll go at once."
And the frightened creature left the room in a hurry. Alone with the corpse, John began the task he loathed, examining the dead woman to see if there was any indication as to what had caused her death. Gritting his teeth, he started with her head, gently feeling her neck for signs of anything broken. There was nothing. Neither was the face marked in any way, nor did her breath smell of any poison, and there was no swelling of the lips or tongue. Indeed, other than for a startled expression in the staring eyes, Diana Warwick could have just dropped off to sleep. After looking into them for a second or two, John drew down the lids. Though he was loath to look, the vaginal area revealed recent sexual activity. Surprise indeed, thought John, certain that Tim Paynter was the man involved. But as to the cause of her death, there was no outward sign. Puzzled, John stood up as the door opened to reveal a slim, dark young man. "And who might you be, sir?" he asked John suspiciously. John gave a brief bow. "I'm an apothecary. I'm staying in the inn, and was first on the scene to examine the body." The man nodded his head. "I'm Dr. Penhale." "Well, sir, what have you deduced?" "Nothing at all, sir. It would appear that the woman died of natural causes." "Have you any reason to think she should not?" "None, except for the fact that she was relatively young. That, and, But how to put into words the uncomfortable feeling he had been left with since the disappearance of Isabel? "Except what, sir?" asked the doctor, who had started to examine the body. "Nothing, really. A child vanished the day before yesterday, that is all." Dr. Penhale was examining Diana's privy parts. "Seems this woman had had intercourse shortly before she died." "Yes, I gathered that." "Who was she? Do you know? I mean, did she have a husband?" "She used the title Miss Warwick, and there was no sign of any such person. I rather imagine she was a woman of the world, if you take my meaning." "I do take it, sir. But what do you think caused her to die? Is it possible that a subtle poison has been used?" "It would have to be something unknown, because the wretched woman did not vomit or have laxes." But why do you think it might be murder, Mr. Rawlings? Oh, as I told you, Dr. Penhale, the strange disappearance of a little girl has unsettled me. But it is probably quite coincidental, and Miss Warwick has died naturally. The doctor looked at the corpse again. Do you think it possible that she was smothered? By a pillow, you mean? That, or something similar? In the act of ravishment? John asked. Yes, I would have thought that could have happened. Dr. Penhale shook his dark head. But surely our imaginations are running riot. Here is a woman who died during, or very soon after, Venery. That is all there is to it, unless... Unless? As I said earlier, perhaps her unknown lover took her life. Dr. Penhale gave a short laugh. Here am I, just taken over my father's practice, and a strange death occurs. Well, I will report the matter to the constable. The two men prepared to leave the room, but not before they had stood on either side of the bed, looking at the last mortal remains of Diana Warwick. She was very beautiful, said the doctor. Yes, sir, she was. How old do you reckon her to be? I don't know. It's difficult to say. John gazed at the lovely face, now the colour of a snowdrop. I would think about 40, he said. The physician answered, You're probably right. Shall we cover her up? And the two of them pulled a sheet up and hid that most delectable of women from the world. As they left the room, John turned the key in the lock, and the physician turned on him a look of surprise. Just to make sure no one enters, the apothecary said by way of explanation. Dr. Penhale allowed the first smile of the day to cross his rather set features. You think of everything, Mr. Rawlings. Have you any experience in these matters? Yes, said John shortly, and left it at that. Downstairs, everything was very quiet. Elizabeth sat with Rose, while Mrs. Anstey and Mrs. Legassick, together with Mrs. Bligh, who had joined them, were pretending to read newspapers. They all looked up as John and the doctor came in. Is it true? Elizabeth asked quietly. Yes, I'm afraid it is. She looked into his eyes and asked a silent question, and John shrugged his shoulders, indicating the three other women who sat silent as mice, listening to every word uttered. Come, my dears, he said to the Marchesa and his daughter. Let us step outside. Taking Rose's hand, Elizabeth moved rapidly out of the front door to the street. The apothecary spoke in an urgent undertone. She's dead all right, but with no outward signs of violence, yet both the doctor and I agree that she could have been smothered. He's going to report the matter to the constable. The Marchesa made a face. Tim Painter, she said. Exactly what I thought. John, what are you going to do? I've got to speak to him, and also to Nicholas Kitto, urgently. Have you seen Tim at all? No, not a sign since Mrs. Pill went off in her carriage. Well, I'm going to find him. God's life, I seem to do nothing but spend my time searching this benighted town. Elizabeth smiled. I can think of worse places to look. John grinned. So can I. Tell me one thing. Did Catherine know that we found nothing this early morning? Yes, and it strengthened her determination to come back with reinforcements. Good. Are you all right looking after Rose? Rose and I are always all right. Excellent. Then I'll be off. And planting a swift kiss on the cheeks of the Marchesa and his daughter, John made his way to the Blue Anchor. Exactly as he had thought, he found Tim Painter in the tap-room, downing ale at some speed. Without ado, John went up to him. Good day to you, old boy. But Tim stopped short, seeing the expression on the other's face. How was Diana Warwick when you left her? John asked abruptly. A range of expressions, culminating in one of extreme innocence, raced over the handsome man's features. Well, thank you. That won't do, Painter. The woman's dead, and there is bound to be an inquiry as to how she died, so I'll ask you before the constable does. When and where did you last see her?" Tim swallowed the rest of his glass of ale and drawled, "Well, you could give as good an opinion of that as I, my friend." "How so?" "Because when we left the dining parlour, she complained of feeling a little faint, so I escorted her to her room, and that was the last I saw of her." "But you say she's dead. What a terrible thing. I can scarcely believe it." His expression during this speech was one of studied innocence mixed with shock, and John, watching him, decided that the chap would have made a first-rate actor. "Well, you'd better start believing it," said the apothecary, "because you will have to tell your tale to the constable." Tim looked mortified. "Why? Why should I? I merely escorted the poor woman to her chamber. What have I to do with her death?" His beautifully moderated voice had raised a little in anger, and one or two other customers gave him a glance. John thought carefully, then decided to be forthright. "Look, Tim," he said, "it would be better to make a clean breast of it to me rather than lie to those in authority. William Trethawin is far from stupid, and you could be in serious trouble if you told him a falsehood." Painter turned away, banging his glass down on the counter. "Another pint of your excellent ale, if you please," was all he said. The apothecary had been dismissed, and he knew it. But for all that, he believed little of what had just been said to him. Tim Painter was hiding something. Of that much he was absolutely positive. Nicholas Kitto was the next person he should call on, but he hadn't a notion where the fellow lived. However, a few discreet enquiries at the Blue Anchor, plus the passing of a coin, provided him with the necessary information. It appeared that young Nick was studying to be a lawyer, and currently had taken articles with the firm of Penaluna Brothers. Having received directions as to where this was situated, the apothecary walked to Meneague Street, wondering exactly how he was going to present himself. In the event, though, the situation was made easy for him. Nicholas was just being shown out, face pale as a cloud, with the firm direction to return home. John bowed. "My dear sir, allow me to escort you. You are clearly unwell, and need someone to walk with you." Nicholas, barely recognizing him, gave a feeble nod. "Kind of you, sir." "Not at all. I'm an apothecary, and used to dealing with illness. Here, take my arm." "Gladly," Nicholas replied, and they set off in sad procession, crossing the road and making their way up the street that led to the church. Somewhat to the apothecary's surprise, they walked up to the last house in the lane, a rather large and grand affair, and here they stopped. "Thank you so much," the young man said weakly. John, seizing the moment, answered, "Oh, I couldn't possibly leave you alone. I must hand you into the care of your parents." Nick pulled a face. "I only have a mother, and I believe she might be out. Then I will come and sit with you until she returns, and I won't take no for an answer." Once inside, the apothecary looked round. The house was simply but expensively furnished in tasteful colours. Indeed, it was the best dwelling he had been in since his arrival in Helstone. But he had little time to make more than a cursory glance, for no sooner were they within than Nicholas turned the colour of a blanched almond and collapsed into a chair, his head swinging down between his knees. John, wishing he had his bag of physics and potions, looked round the room and saw several decanters standing on a tray. Rapidly he crossed to it and poured brandy into a glass. This he guided towards Nicholas's lips. The young man sipped and looked up. Then he burst into uncontrollable tears, weeping as loudly and mournfully as a child. Clutching at John's coat, he murmured, "Oh, my God! My God! How can I face the future without her?" This was John's cue, and he took it, the ruthless side of his nature dominant. "You mean Diana?" he said softly. "Yes, of course." "Then you know she's dead?" "Yes, yes," sobbed the wretched youth. "How did you know?" "Because I found her." "I see," said the apothecary, taking a seat beside him. "Now, Perhaps you would like to tell me all about it." There was a silence, broken only by the chiming of a long case clock and the sound of a carter proceeding down the lane. Finally Nicholas spoke, his voice punctuated by sobs.
"How far back do you want me to go?"
he asked tremulously. "To the very beginning," John answered him.
"The first time I met Diana was with my father."
"But I thought you said—"
"Yes, I did. I have a father, but I always thought of him as my uncle, that is, until recently."
"Are you by any chance illegitimate?" John asked. Nick looked at him, his eyes still pouring tears.
"Yes, of course I am."
"Then who is your father?"
"I'd rather not say."
John immediately leapt to the conclusion that the man was a local dignitary, and that was why his identity was being protected. "Very well. Please, go on."
"I first met Diana when I was 12. She was a few years older than I was."
"Probably about 20 years, thought the apothecary irreverently.
"Anyway, she was a poor young girl from Truro, and my father rescued her, brought her to Helstone, and took her under his wing."
Well aware of the meaning of that, John checked himself for being so flippant when the young fellow telling the tale was obviously in extremis. "And where was your mother at this time?" Nicholas made a strange noise.
"My mother has put it about that I am her nephew. She went away to give birth to me, and returned, according to her, with her sister's child. My father has set her up very nicely, as you can see."
John looked about him. Yes, it is an elegant house indeed. A strange expression crossed Nick's face.
"My father is quite an important man, you see."
"I imagined he must be someone of substance." Nicholas looked as if he was longing to go further, but had come to the conclusion that discretion must rule.
"He is,"
was all that he said. John decided that he must return to the matter in hand. "Tell me about yesterday."
"I had arranged to meet Diana early in the morning, at 6 o'clock, before my mother rises. I was going to leave the house and hurry to the Angel."
"Yes?"
"Well, I got there a little late, at about 1:15. I rushed upstairs to Diana's room and knocked on the door. There was no reply, so I tried the handle, and it opened, and I went inside. It was dark within, but the curtains were not drawn, and she was lying on the bed."
Nicholas stopped speaking, and his shoulders began to heave. John, terrified that the young man was going to be seized by another fit of weeping, said, "Finish your story, I beg you."
I bent over her, and then—"
"Go on."
"One of her arms fell over the edge of the bed and swung."
He shot the apothecary a piteous look.
"Oh, Mr. Rawlings, she was dead."
And the poor chap burst into tears once more. Chapter 15. About half an hour later, the apothecary left Nicholas's house, and being so near to the church, entered in order to think quietly. Taking a seat in one of the pews, he got his ideas in order. Firstly, the disappearance of Isabel Pill had now taken on a decidedly sinister aspect. With no sign of the child or her body, it was beginning to look more and more like a case of abduction, despite Gypsy Orchard's graphic description of her death by drowning. Yet, he supposed that somewhere in the dark recesses of Low Pool the body might still be lurking. An unpleasant thought. His mind moved on to the death of Diana Warwick. He completely believed Nick, who, it seemed to the apothecary, would be incapable of weaving such a web of lies and deceit. Yet when asked why he hadn't reported the death to the constable, the poor young man had admitted that he was slightly ashamed of the liaison and had been too afraid to go to the authorities. Tim, on the other hand, was patently lying. But had he murdered her? Indeed, had she been murdered at all? Or had she died of natural causes, due perhaps to overexertion? John looked grim at the last thought. his mind dwelling on what exactly Diana had been. It seemed to him that she was working as a prostitute when Nicholas's father, whoever he might be, had picked her up in Truro and set her up in a little house somewhere. Then, at some stage, she had turned from father to son, presumably when the old man tired of her. It suddenly seemed important to John to discover this unknown person's identity and inquire discreetly whether he had seen the lady recently. Perhaps he might be able to throw some light on the matter of her death. But in any event, the apothecary felt extremely curious as to who the man could possibly be. But how he was going to find out was an entirely different matter. Sighing, he rose from his pew, still thinking hard, and at that moment the church door opened, and the three women, Muriel the Gassick, Tabitha Bligh, and Anne Anstey, entered in a bunch, talking in whispers. Something made John sit down again, and occupying a back pew as he was, behind the entrance door, he knew he hadn't been seen. From this vantage point, he watched them with interest. They were supposed to be cousins, but he had to confess that there was no family resemblance that he could observe, as they came in wildly assorted sizes and shapes. Mrs. Anstey was the largest, oozing out of the top of her gown with an amazing décolletage that made John's head swim. She had white hair swept up under a vast hat, beneath which her lecherous eyes rolled as she cast them round the church, taking in all the artifacts. She was most like Mrs. Bligh to look at, the apothecary supposed, but even then the resemblance was not striking. Tabitha Bligh, who fancied her chance as greatly as Anne, was staring round to see if there were any men present, and not having noticed the apothecary, had a bored expression on her face. "A reasonable place," said Anne Anstey loudly, "for a church." "It certainly is," responded Mrs. Legassick. "But then, I have known it a while." She turned to Tabitha. "Do you remember when—" Here her voice dropped to an inaudible whisper. Tabitha giggled, and inexplicably raised the hem of her garment, revealing a short but shapely leg. Meanwhile, Mrs. Anstey had swept down the aisle as far as the altar rail, where she paused before opening it and moving up to the altar itself. John stared aghast. Though not a particularly religious man, not typical of his time, this behaviour was quite unacceptable. And then, quite unexpectedly, he coughed, not once, but twice. Every head turned, and each lady froze where she stood. There was nothing for it but to rise from his pew and make a bow. They all curtsied in return and hurried towards him. "Oh, Mr. Rawlings, you naughty man! I'm afraid we didn't see you," chirruped Mrs. Legassick. Dying to reply, "That was obvious," John manfully smiled and said, "Truth to tell, I dropped off to sleep," thus covering his tracks. End of Side 7. Side 8. Mrs. Anstey had hastily retreated from the altar, leaving the rail undone. She now swept forward and curtsied once more, revealing a great deal of cleavage in the process. "Mr. Rawlings," she said in a deep voice, "what are you doing here alone? You're usually surrounded by a horde of females." "How kind of you to say so," he answered, clutching his hat to his heart. She stared at him suspiciously, wondering whether he was being facetious. John kept a straight face. "I was just admiring the beauties of this church," she said, just a little uncertainly. "It is indeed very fine. Now, ladies, will you give me the pleasure of escorting you back to the inn?" John had the strangest feeling that he should not leave them alone in the place. Mrs. Bligh smiled up at him, her eyes vanishing as she did so in a horde of merry creases. "We are quite capable of making our own way, sir." "Then in that case," John said firmly, "I shall wait for you." He saw mouths forming protests and raised a hand. "I absolutely insist. I shall sit down again and await you. Please continue to look around and take no notice of me whatsoever." He sat, and they continued their perambulations, though the apothecary could not help noticing that Mrs. Anstey stayed well away from the high altar. 10 minutes later they were done, and John led his troop out into the open countryside in which the church stood. They all paused for a moment, drinking in the fresh Cornish air, looking about them to where sheep grazed in the fields and the hills rose beyond. It was such a peaceful scene to encompass so much recent unpleasantness, yet in the apothecary's experience this was often the way. His mind went back to the beauty of Gunnersbury House, standing in its own fine grounds, and he thought for a long moment about Emilia, and how much he missed her. At that second, he doubted he would ever marry again, and he felt enormously saddened. Realizing that he was standing, looking glum, John rallied. "Ladies, are you ready to return?" Mrs. Anstey's voice drowned the replies of the others. "I think, sir, that we will call on the Colquites and the rest of our cousins. As you know, the brothers live locally. It is only a short step from here." For no reason that he could think of, the apothecary felt a thrill of unease. Yet there was nothing harmful about the men. The Colquites were a silly old couple, like a pair of spinsters. As for Sayce, he beamed joviality at all and sundry, while Rhys was so neat, so tidy, so minute, in fact, that he could pose a threat to nobody. Yet there was something about them collectively that John found disquieting. However, he thrust the notion away. "Of course, I shall walk home alone. Good day to you." He bowed once more and parted company from them, proceeding back to the Angel, solitary and deep in thought. On the way there, he saw Tim Painter striding up the street at a fair rate, going in the same direction as the three ladies. John wondered whether to hail him, but thought better of it when he remembered their parting. He proceeded onward, and was nearing the Angel when his attention was drawn by the arrival of a heavily built and somewhat old-fashioned coach. Importantly stepping from it was a mature man, greeted with the utmost respect by the passing populace. Women bobbed and men doffed their hats, while a small child burst into tears at all the fuss. Drawing nearer, the apothecary recognized him as the fellow who had been walking along the street the night before the Furry Dance. Turning to a passer-by, he said, "Who is that man?" "Baron Godolphin, sir." Hence all the bowing and scraping. I might have guessed. He's the local peer of the realm, Baron Godolphin of Helstone. Ah, that would explain it. Seized by the sudden idea that he could possibly be looking at Nicholas's actual father, who was definitely a local dignitary, John gave an elaborate bow and was rewarded by a cold glance from eyes hard as steel. Just the type to have fathered a bastard child, thought John, and said, "Servant, sir," in an affected London accent. "Do I know you?" asked the other nastily. "No, sir, you do not. I was merely passing the time of day." At this moment, their conversation, if it could be described as such, was interrupted by the landlord appearing in the doorway, bowing and rubbing his hands. "Good day, Lord Godolphin. A pleasure to see you again, sir." "Good day," his lordship replied briefly, and marched into the inn. After a moment's hesitation, the apothecary followed. Lord Godolphin strode into the inner recesses, but John, hearing a noise on the stairs, looked up just in time to see a shape covered by a cloth being carried down on a plank. Behind it came the constable, looking grim-faced. Catching sight of John, he called out, "A word with you, sir, if you please." "Certainly." He reached the bottom, and the two men carrying the body came to a brief halt. "To the mortuary, Will?" "Aye." John asked, "Have you informed the coroner?" "A message has been sent, yes." William Trethowin hesitated. "Do you think she did die naturally, sir?" "I'm not sure. There are no marks on her body, as you probably noticed." For a large man, the constable seemed to wither. "I didn't look too closely." "Well, I did, and I can assure you that neither the doctor nor I could see any. But that doesn't rule out smothering." "But who could have done that?" "I think," John replied thoughtfully, that it could have been one of several people. That night, with Rose safely in bed and Jed keeping watch from the tap-room, John and the Marchesa stepped out into the cool air. "So what is your opinion?" she asked, as direct as ever. "About Diana, do you mean? Her and the child?" The apothecary looked thoughtful. "I'm not sure about either of them." "Is there a link, do you believe?" "It's possible, though for the life of me I can't see what it could be." Elizabeth frowned. As they had apparently never met before they arrived, it certainly presents a difficult problem. But supposing there were some connection between them, that Mrs. Pill knew Miss Warwick, and they had come here by special arrangement, what then? The Marchesa shook her dark head. "I don't think so, somehow, though you might be right. Tell me all you have discovered about the woman." "As far as I can make out, she was a poor prostitute from Truro, living as best she could. Then she was taken under the wing of Nicholas Kitto's mysterious father." "Who is he?" Elizabeth interrupted. "That I'm not sure of. You know I went to see young Kitto today." She nodded. "Well, he confessed to me that he was the bastard child of some local bigwig or other. He also told me that Diana was his father's mistress, and Nick took her on." A lesser woman might have looked shocked, but Elizabeth merely nodded. "I see. A strange situation, but not unheard of. Have you any idea who this mysterious parent is?" "There's a local peer called Lord Godolphin. It could be him, I suppose." "What makes you think so?" "He's all ruffles and hard face. But you've seen him yourself. Do you remember the night before the Furry, when Diana hastily crossed the road?" "Yes, I do." "Do you recall a middle-aged man, probably about 60, walking along on his own?" "Yes." "That was him." Elizabeth looked extremely thoughtful. "Quite a handsome fellow in his way. Perhaps Diana hurried away in order to avoid him. At the time, it seemed an extraordinary thing for her to do." "It did indeed, but now it makes sense." "Yes." "And it also provides a motive for murder." "You mean Lord Godolphin killed her for some reason or other?" "Either him or Tim Painter." The apothecary braced his shoulders. "I must have another look at the body. That is, if I can get permission." "Do you know where she has been taken?" "To the mortuary. I'll contact the constable first thing in the morning." "A good idea." The Marchesa smiled up at him. "Now, we have spoken enough of death and murder. Let us talk of something else." "Our plans, perhaps," said John, turning his full gaze on her. She shook her head, and her dark hair was caught in the moonlight, giving it a silvery sheen. "You'll be beautiful even when you're old," he said. She laughed. "What are you talking about? I am old." "No, you're not. You have the spirit of eternal youth." "I might have in your eyes, but actually, I'm 47 in August." It was on the tip of John's tongue to tell her that next month he would be 34, but he held back. Instead, he took her in his arms and kissed her. Then, laughing, they made their way downhill and made love quite naturally in the shadow of the trees that lay at the bottom, a rapturous experience to add their own sounds of pleasure to the noises of the night all about them. It was an unforgettable heightening of their relationship, and afterwards, walking back slowly towards the inn, their arms round each other, John felt almost emboldened to ask her yet again if she would stay with him forever. But once more he remained silent, and as the evening came finally to an end, he could do nothing more than bid her good night and go quietly to his room. Chapter 16. John woke early, and putting his head round his daughter's door, saw that she was still asleep. But there was a stirring in the street below that was attracting his attention. Dressing quickly, he went out of the Angel's front entrance, then stood, somewhat dismayed by what he was seeing. The blind fiddler and his band were leaving town, playing as they went. First came the gaffer, his dark hair and his blackened spectacles gleaming in the early morning sunshine. A pace behind him, as usual, was Gideon, the monkey sitting on his shoulder and banging the tambourine. Behind him, in their turn, came the flautist and the kettledrums player, the mandora and fagotto players bringing up the rear. The apothecary's heart sank. The band's departure meant that there would be no further festivities, which, in turn, signalled the exit of most of the people who had come to Helstone to see the furry. And consequently, most of the people present when Isabel Pill had vanished and Diana Warwick had been killed. At any moment, he was going to be left with both these mysteries to unravel and no witnesses to help him. In a sudden panic, John fell into step beside the fiddler. "You're going from Helstone, I take it?" The head beneath its battered hat turned slightly, and the darkened glasses flashed in the apothecary's direction. For one incredible second, John had the impression that he was being regarded. "Mr. Rawlings, isn't it?" "Yes. How clever of you to know." "Ah, not just a pretty face, be I?" The fiddler laughed, and John saw a flash of white teeth rather than the rotting brown stumps he had half expected. "May I ask why you're leaving?" "Well, sir, it be over. All dead and buried for another year. So what's the point in staying on?" "Where will you go next?" John asked. "Wherever there's a fair or festivity in Devon or Cornwall. That's where you'll find us." "Do you only travel in the West Country?" "It's been known for us to go as far as Wiltshire, sir, and to Dorset." Something about this remark struck the apothecary as significant, but for the life of him he couldn't place what it was. He dropped back a pace or two in order to speak to the others. Gideon, of whom the monkey had obviously grown fond, had now retrieved his tambourine from Wilkes's leathery claws and was banging and whirling it enthusiastically. The monkey, meanwhile, was chattering away, its face perpetually sad beneath its small tricorn hat. It bared its teeth as it saw the apothecary, but whether it was grinning or snarling, he could not be certain. John strove to remember the names of the rest. The little flautist was James, and the craggy-faced kettledrum man with the wicked roving eye was George. The aesthetic mandora player was called Zachariah, while his jolly fat friend, who puffed his cheeks out while he blew, was Giles. John turned his attention to the mandora man. "Are you sorry to be leaving Helstone?" he asked brightly. "No, sir, I'm not. Seems like this furry has been cursed, what with the little maid vanishing and Miss Warwick dying so suddenly. A shocking affair." Giles, who had been blowing hard, stopped for breath. "I reckon the gaffer's right to move on. Mysterious, though, ain't it? Do you know aught about it, sir?" "Not much more than you, I should imagine." The fat man looked slightly downcast. "I thought you might, seeing as how you mixed with them." "I wasn't really that close," John answered evasively. A small crowd had started to cheer the musicians from the town, and amongst them was Rose, still in her night shift, but at least with a pair of shoes on. Unaware of her father's presence, she ran straight up to Gideon.
"Oh, dear, are you going?"
"Yes, we'm be off."
"And you're taking Wilkes with you?"
"Of course we are. He's my little pet, ain't he?"
"Can I hold him once more?"
"Yes, you certainly can." And Gideon handed the monkey to her. It was almost as big as she was, but for all that, Rose cuddled the animal enthusiastically. John was vividly reminded of her mother, who at one stage had wanted to adopt every stray creature they had come across. He rather feared that their daughter might well have inherited the same characteristic. He watched her as she fondled the monkey's ugly head and held one of its claw-like hands. She looked up and saw him.
"Oh, Papa, he's going away."
"Yes, my dear, but he's happy with Gideon and the gaffer. Now hand him back." She plonked a kiss on the grim little face, then did so. John looked at her and saw that a solitary tear was running down beside her nose. "Don't be sad, darling. I'm sure you'll see him again one day."
"I do hope so."
She brightened up.
"What shall we do today, Papa?"
"I have a commitment this morning. At least, I hope I have," he added in an undertone. "But after that, I will be free to do whatever you want. Could we go to the sea again? Provided Mrs. Elizabeth wants to go, yes. Is she going to become my mother? Rose asked, her directness reminding John of the woman in question. He looked at her, thinking she was young yet to know his true feelings on the matter, which were, to be honest, totally confused. Perhaps, he said. I see, Rose answered, and flashed him a look which confirmed his belief that she was an old soul with ancient wisdom. The truth is that I don't believe Mrs. Elizabeth wishes to marry again, he found himself blurting out. His daughter nodded, said, Poor papa, and taking him by the hand, led him back towards the inn, as if she were the adult and he the little child. As soon as he had consumed a reasonable breakfast, John Rawlings went to see the constable in his place of work. He came immediately to the point. I want to have another look at Miss Warwick's body, if that is agreeable to you. William straightened up and wiped the sweat from his brow. Why, sir? I need to see if there's any indication that she was smothered. Have you informed the doctor of this? I called at his house on the way here, but he was out on his rounds, so I've come to you in the hope that you'll give permission. I would rather Dr. Penhale agreed. Well, that means a wait of several hours. The constable hesitated, weighing up the pros and cons, then finally said with a sigh, Oh, very well, but I insist on accompanying you. Glad that he had been given the opportunity of a second examination, John nodded with an enthusiasm he did not feel. The mortuary was attached to the workhouse, situated in Meneague Street, a mere stone's throw from Trethowan's place of work. Walking side by side, John carrying a small medical bag with him, the two men made their way there, walking through the May sunshine in silence. As always, it was the overpowering smell of substances used, hopefully, to counteract the stink of corrupting flesh that the apothecary disliked. Putting a handkerchief to his nose, he walked amongst the slabs, each bearing a shrouded white figure, to the one that the mortuary keeper had indicated. Turning back the cloth, Diana Warwick's face came into view. She was still beautiful, even in death, though now, rigor mortis having been and gone, her cheeks had a fallen-in look, and her features were drawing together round her mouth. John couldn't help but notice that the constable turned away as the apothecary leant over the body and peered into Diana's nostrils. If she had fought for breath as she died, then surely some small particle of what had been pressed over her face would have been inhaled. And there it was, 3 tiny white feathers, indicating surely that a pillow had been held down. Giving a small cry of triumph, John fished in his bag and produced a pair of tweezers. Inserting them gently, he pulled out the feathers and dropped them into a box. Then he turned to Trethowan. She was smothered, all right. How do you know, sir? Here's the evidence. See? And he showed him the telltale feathers. The constable nodded his head slowly. This entirely alters the case. I will inform the coroner immediately. I think, said John thoughtfully, that every man who saw her on the night she was killed should be interviewed. But just who were they? Tim Painter, for one, and young Kitto, of course. I'll see them directly, and try Lord Godolphin, the apothecary added. The constable gave him an anguished glance. I wouldn't dare do that. Why, it could cost me my job. Is the man so powerful? He's in charge of a great deal of Helstone, that's for sure. Would you like me to question him? If you can get within a mile of him, you're welcome to try. Well, I can only do my best, the apothecary answered, none too confidently. As it transpired, he did not have far to look. John had crossed the road and was making his way back to Dr. Penhale's house, hopefully to catch the man in, when a familiar carriage drew up in front of him. A servant leapt to the ground and pulled the steps down, and out got the familiar figure of his lordship, who proceeded, with a swagger, to make for the physician's front door. Seizing the opportunity, John followed in his wake, and arrived just a step behind him as the man rang the bell. He turned as he became aware of the apothecary's proximity. John bowed courteously. "We meet again, sir." The steely eyes regarded him. "So it would seem." John, sizing the man up, decided he was arrogant and would probably respond to flattery. "I hope your lordship is not in ill health," he said. "I am perfectly well, thank you." The apothecary made a self-deprecating move. "I thought, as you were here—" His voice trailed away, and he gestured to the doctor's nameplate. "I've come to see the quack for something for gout, if you must know." "May I suggest the juice of germander drunk over several weeks?" John replied smoothly. "I've always found it extremely efficacious when prescribing to my patients." Lord Godolphin's eyebrows shot up, but he was spared from making a reply by the door being answered by a woman servant. She curtsied on seeing who stood there. "Oh, my lord, the doctor's still out, I fear. I am expecting him soon, though. Would you care to come in and wait?" "No, I would not." Lord Godolphin turned away and was about to leave when he stopped abruptly and asked John a question. "Are you a physician, sir?" "I'm an apothecary, sir, with a practice in London. I can certainly prepare you a concoction of germander to tide you over, should you so desire." His lordship hesitated, then said, "Very well. I shall try some. I shall send a servant round this evening to collect it. Not a bit of it, sir. I insist on bringing it myself. Where do you live?" "At Godolphin, in Brieg," the other replied grandly. "Very good, my lord. Shall we say 6 o'clock?" "Yes, as good a time as any," answered his lordship, and stepped into his carriage without further ado. The servant, still standing in the doorway, stared at John questioningly. "Could you tell your master that Mr. Rawlings called with some information for him? I will return later," he said, then turned on his heel and headed back purposefully for the Angel Inn. Elizabeth and Rose had gone for a drive to the sea, which gave the apothecary time to seek out some wild germander growing on an old ruined cottage. This he compounded using a small pestle and mortar which he had brought in his medical bag. Then he drained it as best he could and poured the juice into a clean, empty bottle. Having some time to kill, the apothecary decided on a walk, and found his feet leading him in the direction of the low pool, that place of mystery and occasional tragedy, according to local legend. But he had only just got close to the bottom of the street when a familiar voice said, "Buy my heather for luck, sir." He turned and found himself looking into the clear-water eyes of Gypsy Orchard. "How much?" he said, putting his hand into his pocket. "As much as you care to give me," she answered, and smiled at him. There was something immensely attractive about the woman, John thought, and he wondered about her personal life, wondered whether she had a man or even children. He extended 2 shillings. "Will that be enough?" "More than plenty, sir. I've charmed the heather for extra good fortune." "It will make me lucky, eh?" "It helps to ward off evil spirits." "Surely there can't be any of those in Helstone," he said, continuing to smile. The look on her face removed his grin. "I wouldn't be too sure of that, sir." "What do you mean?" "The Furry Dance attracts all sorts of people to see it." "Who, exactly?" "People who serve the Earth Goddess, and also those who serve the Dark Master." "Do you mean witches?" "I do. Both white and black." John was silent, thinking about what she was saying, not consciously having realized before that there was a difference. "Could you explain that?" he asked. A cautious expression crossed Gypsy Orchard's face. "No, it's not good to say too much, sir. Remember, they hang witches still." And John did remember, and asked no further questions. Instead, he said, "Why should they be attracted to the Furry Dance, to Flora Day?" "Because of its origins. It's pagan, don't forget. Some might think it's a form of devil worship. What nonsense!" he exclaimed loudly. "It's a tribute to the coming of spring, that is all, and its roots are pre-Christian," she answered with a secretive smile. The apothecary decided that further conversation on that particular subject was useless. He looked serious. "Tell me again, do you truly believe that Isabel Pill drowned?" Those amazing, clear eyes gazed at him. "I would stake my own life on it." "Then where is she?" "That I cannot tell, sir." He nodded. "And now Miss Warwick is dead." He decided to test her. "Has she been murdered, do you think?" "I told her fortune the other night, and all I could see was darkness. I felt that all was not well, but I denied it even to myself." "I see. No, sir, I don't think you do. Being a charmer, having clear sight, is not always easy. There are certain people who scoff." She gave him a pointed glance. "But fortunately not many round these parts. But the worst comes when you know that someone is going to die. Then you're hard put to it to know what to say." John's mind went back to the old crone who had foretold Emilia's death. She had had no trouble spilling out the dread words. At the time, he had thought it was a friend playing a practical joke, but now he could see that the gypsy woman had been absolutely right. Emilia had died as she had described, and he had been left a widower. With a wrench, he brought his mind back to the present. "So, you have nothing further to say on that matter?" "Not at present. I shall consult my crystal and let you know what I see." John's curiosity overcame him. "Tell me, Gypsy Orchard, where do you live?" "In a little cottage not far from Low Pool. Many think I dwell in the hedges, but that life would be too unsettling for me. It's in that cottage that I keep my cats and my crystal, and people know where to find me." "But your name suggests someone who spends a lot of time outdoors." "I do. But I was named after the place in which I was born. Does that answer your question?" "Very adequately." "Then I'll be on my way, sir. You know where to come looking should you need help." And with that, the gypsy picked up her basket, smiled, and was gone. Chapter 17. Godolphin was a truly magnificent house. John, having borrowed Elizabeth's coach, together with Jed and his accompanying guard, could not help but feel impressed as they turned into the half-moon carriage sweep, and a pillared white building, gracious and elegant of line, and bearing much in its architecture of the reign of William and Mary, stood before him. The light in the sky was just beginning to fade, and thus the beautiful place seemed to languish in its dark parkland, like a lily that had been plucked and then discarded. The apothecary, enraptured, called up to Jed, "Stop a minute. I want to look." Candles had been lit, and appeared to shine from every window, so that the place had a fairy-like quality, a glittering, breathless charm that left the apothecary almost devoid of his senses. Indeed, he felt quite weakened by the house's spell as the carriage moved forward again and deposited him at the front door. In response to the tolling of a bell, a liveried footman appeared. "Yes, sir?" "Lord Godolphin is expecting me. John Rawlings of Shug Lane, London." Much to his surprise, the servant answered, "Oh, yes, sir, if you would follow me." The apothecary was led through an elegant and richly appointed hallway to where, in a library full of books, his lordship sat reading a newspaper, a pair of spectacles on his nose. He looked up, and actually had the good manners to rise from his seat. "Oh, Rawlings, how nice of you to call. Do you have the physic with you?" "I do indeed, sir." And John produced the bottle of juice from his coat pocket. Godolphin held it up to the light. "This will do me good, I feel certain of it. Now tell me, have you dined?" "No, I was returning to the inn, but—" He hunched his shoulders and spread his hands. Then you can do so with me. Truth to tell, I could do with a little company." John looked through the spectacles at the steely eyes behind. They were as hard as ever, but a telltale flush had risen in the nobleman's cheeks. "I should be delighted," the apothecary answered, glad that Elizabeth was a woman of resources who would not complain if he did not put in an appearance. "Fact is," Lord Godolphin continued, "that her ladyship is away visiting relatives, something she frequently does." John remained silent, unable to think of a fitting reply. "I was hoping that you would tell me something of your life in London. I visit the capital from time to time, but it is not the same as dwelling there, in my opinion." "I would be delighted to do so, sir. May I sit down?" "By all means. How remiss of me. What can I get you to drink?" "A sherry would be splendid, thank you." End of Side 8.